Good evening and welcome.
Hungary.
Thank you so much for coming. It's wonderful to see so many friends and we have such a distinguished and interesting alumni in London, and thank you all very much for joining us this evening. It's my privilege to moderate tonight's discussion, and I'd like to just briefly introduce my distinguished colleagues. To my immediate right is Jason Bordoff, who joined the Columbia SIPA faculty in January of 2013, where he came from the White House, where he was the Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Energy and Climate Change, also on the staff of the National Security Council. Prior to that, he held senior policy positions on the National Economic Council in the White House and also the Council on Environmental Quality. He is one of the nation's top energy policy experts and served in the administration from 2009. He's a professor at SIPA, a professor of practice, and also serves as the founding director of our Energy Center, the Global Energy Policy Center. And as you'll hear, Jason's research and policy interests really lie at the intersection of economics, energy, the environment, and national security. I could go on, but he has an extraordinary background before that, having been at the Brookings Institution, Harvard Law graduate. I'm also an attorney and one of the few at SIPA, so I'm delighted to have a fellow traveler. He studied at Oxford, where he was a Marshall Scholar, and has a BA from Brown University. Next to Jason, I'm really delighted to welcome Tina Fordham, who's a managing director at Citi and is the first and only chief political analyst on Wall Street. She has been named in the top 100 most influential women in finance, the top 19 economists on Wall Street, and has been at Citi since 2003. She really advises companies and investors at the executive and board level on the implications of macro global political developments. And I think I'm particularly proud that she is a SIPA graduate. She's really pioneered a political science-based approach to investment research, and she has worked on areas that are very difficult to quantify and where judgment is crucial also, areas of geopolitical and socioeconomic risks, as well as more traditional coverage of elections and policy developments. She formulated in 2012 the concept of vo populi risk, which is identifying a new kind of political risk driven by more volatile, more influential public opinion. And this has really been described by must-reading and best-in-class by the likes of senior officials, CEOs, as well as many institutional investors. If you haven't seen her on TV, you're not watching TV, because she's there all the time. And she's also, of course, participates in many important public intellectual venues such as Davos, Fortune's Most Powerful Women, and many other forums. She earned her master's in international affairs from SIPA, and I think is really an extraordinary analyst. And next to Tina, I'm really delighted to welcome Jan Svejnar, who joined the SIPA faculty a couple of years ago from the University of Michigan, Ross School of Business, where he was the executive director of the William Davidson Institute. Jan really has an extraordinary background. He served as the director of the International Policy Center at the Ford School of Public Policy at Michigan. He is the founder and chairman of a PhD program in economics in Prague. He's been chairman of the supervisory board of CSOB Bank, He's a fellow of the European Economic Association and a research fellow of the Center for Economic Policy Research here in London. He's the author of numerous books and editor of more. And in 2012, Professor Svejnar was honored for his distinguished work with the 2012 Neuron Prize from the Prague-based Karol Janeček Endowment for Research and Science. He was one of 3 honorees for lifelong achievement, a recognition considered to be the Czech Republic's most prestigious for science. And at SIPA, he is the director of the Center for Global Economic Governance, the founding director of that center, which is really offering extraordinary new both research and activity around issues affecting all of us. So with that, too lengthy, but I hope give you a flavor of my distinguished colleagues, I'd like to invite us to open a debate and discussion about the US and Europe from an economics, from an energy, from a geopolitical perspective. And perhaps I could invite Jan to start us off.
All right. Thank you very much, Merit. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a real pleasure to be here. I should mention that Merit was very influential in recruiting me to Columbia, and in fact, the competing offer for us from the London School of Economics. So I was deciding between coming and be here with you, but not knowing you, and being here with you and knowing you. So it's much better, actually, I must say, to be here in the latter capacity. So as Merit mentioned, we have about 30 people associated with the Center on Global Economic Governance, looking at some of the most important issues relating to the world economy, the effects of globalization on the world, and whether the institutions that are there are adequate or inadequate, and in what ways. And I think talking about the US and Europe is really important. When we look at the last 20, 25 years. So in 1990, US and Europe represented 60% of the world GDP. Today, it's closer to 40%. Right? It's the fastest change in the relative position of economic power that we've seen in history that we can find. And the question is that a trend that's likely to continue? Obviously, 0 is a lower bound, but is it likely to continue? How fast? Or is there going to be a real difference? And there is a big difference in the last several years in the response to the financial crisis. And we're talking about things that, of course, you talk about, you think about, you live. So, come and join in the discussion. Let me just outline a few of the features that I think are important. And what I think is important is that the crisis obviously came from the US and had an effect everywhere. But there's been very asymmetric response to it in the US and Europe. Many of us are critical, and many people are critical about the US. It could be doing better. But when you look at Europe and the US and juxtapose it, the US economy is doing considerably better on some of the basic indicators like economic growth, now even reduction in unemployment, growth of employment. It's not rapid growth. It's not something that would be considered totally adequate. But compared to Europe, it's much better. So really the big issue is Europe. We just had a conference in Paris that the Center on Global Economic Governance organized together with Sciences Po, and then to which we brought actually leading thinkers from all over Europe and the United States. And we've asked what's happening and focused on the role of the state in stimulating or not stimulating economic growth. And there obviously, as always among economists, a lot of disagreement. But the few things that people agreed on was that Europe really lacks the leadership that would be needed at this point to prepare a strategy, agree on a strategy, and move things ahead. Europe really is a very strong, until last year, it was the largest economic bloc, single economic bloc in the world. Because it has been stagnating or growing very slowly over the last several years, the US NAFTA has now surpassed it. But still, it's an incredibly impressive aggregation of people, human capital, economic might that in some sense is underperforming. Right? So Europe, if you want to take a positive view, could really do much, much better. The US has in some sense eliminated many inefficiencies and has to be innovative, and it's good at being innovative, but has to be innovative in order to expand, grow, and move ahead Europe needs to do that as well, obviously, but if it also eliminated some of the inefficiencies that it still has in terms of not finishing complete integration and so on and so forth, it could do much better. So in some sense, Europe is significantly underperforming, and it could either continue underperforming or it could actually catch up. And I think the important thing is, again, go back to around 1990. If we were sitting here and all of us reading newspapers and scientific journals, we would be talking about how Europe, and Japan for that matter, are going to overtake the United States. Right? That was the topic of the day. Since World War II, those economies have grown and have basically arrived at that point, and it was just a question where, in which sectors first, and then go ahead. And then the last 20, 25 years have been totally different from what the expectations were then. So it just shows you how different approaches and ability to guide the economy can have very, very different effects. And so my premise here for the discussion is that Europe could do much better. It is moving in the direction that it needs to, in particular the Eurozone countries, emphasis on the banking, creating a banking union, and some form of consolidation, coordination of fiscal policies or approach to fiscal issues, I think is very important, and that came across in the conference as well. There is, as you know, a major difference in approach to how to approach the stimulus or lack thereof, and the Germans are very conservative. The French finance minister, Michel Sapin, came to the conference and opened it up and basically gave a speech in which he said, we're meaning it very seriously. The restructuring of the government is a serious restructuring, but we need a little bit more time. We basically need until 2017 to start satisfying the criteria, to which the German participants were saying this is going to be very hard to accept by the German government. And so I think Europe is at a crossroads where the two major powers, so to be economic powers on the continent, are not seeing eye to eye. They are in terms of where they want to go, but not the immediate steps. And of course, you are here, so you can tell us better than anybody else where the UK is going to go in terms of staying within the Union or not, and how active a role it will play. So let me stop here with the introductory remarks and pass the baton on.
Please, thank you very much.
Good. Well, I want to start by saying that today has been an absolutely amazing day for me. I spent the first half of the day in Buckingham Palace. This is the only time in my life I'll be able to say this, I'm sure, attending a Queen's Honours ceremony, and to have had such a wonderful introduction from Merit and to be here with SIPA colleagues is tremendous. It's a tremendous honor. I thought about something that Sophia Loren famously said about herself. She said, everything you see here is because of pasta. I would say everything you heard about me is because of SIPA. It was the making of me, the best decision I ever made, and I think it's a testament to the idea of making a virtue of your differences, in my case of being a complete misfit. Or as they would say more charitably here in my adopted country, falling between two stools. I have been based in London for 12 years, and in my role as the chief global political analyst at Citi, I spend a lot of time talking to US investors about Europe, which they don't understand, and European investors about the United States, which they don't understand, and then people in all of the other countries because they don't understand each other either, which is a very interesting vantage point to have. And I try to be global and synthetic and macro about that approach. So building upon what we heard from Jan, where are we now? The last couple of years, financial markets were gripped by all kinds of concerns. In terms of what comes into my territory, though, there were two big considerations. And one was, would the Eurozone break up? And if so, it would have happened probably because the Italian or Greek governments would have blown up as a sort of the first canary in the coal mine, which would have led to contagion in the bond markets and everything else. And then would the US go over the fiscal cliff? Would there be a sort of a self-inflicted wound coming from the US political dysfunction? And this really marked a very important change in the way financial markets had reacted to political risks, right? Because when I first started doing this over 15 years ago, it was emerging markets political risk. Here we had developed markets potentially generating the end of the world as we knew it. right? And that is something that's quite remarkable. Well, where are we now? Neither of those two big cataclysmic risks actually happened, and I think that's quite important. A lot of US investors really bet against the Eurozone, and they bet against the euro. Now, the European Union has survived, and the euro as a currency has survived. What do we have to thank for that? Well, mostly we have Mario Draghi to thank for that and his whatever it takes, because just with that one sentence, he really underwrote the continuation of the currency union. But there's still plenty of room for other things to go wrong, and we're seeing this in markets today. The question is really whether central banks can continue to mask political risks, and I write about this a lot in my research. Why haven't markets reacted to geopolitical risks? The Russia-Ukraine tensions, something that I've followed for a long time, having lived in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and ISIS in the Middle East. Markets have barely batted an eyelash, and oil prices aren't moving very much, which Jason will tell us about more. There are two reasons for this: liquidity from central banks masking a growth shock, and we think shale gas and supply dynamics probably masking a potential oil price shock. So that's why we're not seeing a big response there, also because the US is continuing to grow. But that's not to say that geopolitical risks and country level risks aren't really proliferating, because they are. One of the things that I've hypothesized about in my research is whether one of the side effects of central bank action isn't to actually produce a sort of moral hazard in foreign policy, whereby might tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of more people die in some parts of the world because markets are at present not doing their historic function of registering geopolitical risks. So in a sense, it makes it easier for to prevent intervention, to delay intervention. Let's put it that way. That's one theory. Thinking about our U.S. and Europe theme. All of us Americans in the room can bemoan the lack of bipartisanship, the dysfunctionality, all of these considerations. But for whatever reason, Congress at least has started to pass continuing budget resolutions, which means they pose much less of a clear and present danger to financial markets. Central banks really have become these super empowered entities that act where elected leaders won't or can't. And that limited political capital and another theme I write about a lot, fragmentation risk, I think is not going away. Moving ahead to what we need to think about, we have midterm elections, of course, in November. I don't see those as being particularly market moving. You can look at Charlie Cook and Nate Silver and all the prognosticators to crunch the numbers in the 6 states where you might see some change. But for global investors, and for companies, even if both houses of Congress are controlled by the same party, by Republicans, you still have divided government, and we still, in my view, don't have much prospect for big legislation coming out. That's an analyst view, not a political party view. You'll hear something different from the political parties. I am, though, more concerned about Europe, and markets have started to register this as well. We had some negative data coming out of the core, right? We've gotten used to weakness in the Eurozone periphery. German industrial production numbers came off in the last couple of days. I think this is just markets registering something which has been evident for a while, and that is the fact that the Eurozone recovery is quite weak and mainly driven by Germany. We think that, for example, the continued Russia-Ukraine tensions and sanctions also having an impact, particularly on the agricultural producers in the periphery who are hit by sanctions. So the Russia-Ukraine tensions work both ways. They don't just hit the Russian economy, they also have an impact in Europe and probably in Germany. And although I was named the top 19 economists on Wall Street, I'm not an economist at all. I use political science in my views, but our Citi economists are writing about this, and I think it's a kind of underappreciated consideration how the likelihood of ongoing tensions between Russia and the West is not going to do the Eurozone recovery any favors. And again, focusing on the kinds of things that we know are coming, elections next year. We have a return to the European election cycle with elections here in the UK In Spain, which has had a majority government from a mainstream party for the last 4 years. And that has been a remarkable source of political stability in a country which really underwent some tough reforms and saw some real socioeconomic pressures. You're not going to have a single party majority government probably in Spain. And in terms of the outlook for the UK elections, following on from the Scottish referendum, which was an incredible thing to observe. Yes, in our family we had great debates about this. My children have opined and come up with diplomatic solutions about what ought to happen. But one of the things that was really powerful to see was how younger Scots galvanized around this agenda of independence, how you had political participation rates going through the roof. And to cut to the chase, even though we didn't get Scottish independence in the end, looking to Catalan referendum and other pressures, fragmentation risk and the possibility of micro-states emerging and more referenda, I think is very real. And in our Vox Populi research, we talk about why this is. I think it's a backlash to globalization. Somebody raised income inequality. You know, I'm not Thomas Piketty, and I read the Cliff Notes version of his book. You can get a little executive summary on Amazon if, like me, you looked at it and said, I can't do that. What I decided, though, was that because people believe income inequality is real, it doesn't really matter how real it is or to what extent it's real. I think what's maybe more important, though, is the middle class sense of stagnation. The idea that for the first time Americans don't believe their children will have a better standard of living than they do, and this sense of going into reverse is fueling anti-establishment and anti-elite political developments, whether it's strengthening local identity or demand for anti-establishment parties. And that is not connected with growth. When I was working on Vox Populi, my economist colleagues told me that's going to be a very interesting piece of history, Tina, but once growth returns, it's all going to go back to normal, except it hasn't. And again, taking the UK example, the UK has had a very robust recovery, but it hasn't been felt, equally is the wrong choice, but it's not been felt by the man on the street. And that is evident, I think, in the 25% number for UKIP. Anti-immigration sentiment and anti-elite sentiment are strongly correlated with anti-EU sentiment, and that is why I think, despite an economic recovery, the next election cycle and probably the one after it are going to continue to feature an appetite for challenger parties that are going to be anti-mainstream and going to make it difficult for companies and investors to anticipate developments. It means more regulation, among other things, and more uncertainty about the investment environment.
Thank you very much, Tina. I'd like to invite Jason to offer some perspectives around the energy picture in the US and its implications for Europe.
Sure, thank you. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to Merritt and everyone at Columbia for organizing this. I, as you heard, joined the faculty in January 2013. I direct the Center on Global Energy Policy, which we have limited time, so I won't describe it, but that's also first because we have limited time, and also because you can pick up one of these on your way out, and it will tell you everything that you need to know about it. I joined after spending 4 years in the White House as the energy advisor to President Obama, and was recruited initially by Merritt's predecessor, John Coatsworth, and then I remember at the time actually trying to figure out whether to leave government to come to SIPA, and thought, let me call one or two of the Columbia faculty who I had long admired and most respected, and I thought had combined high-level policy work with first-rate academic research, and you were the first person I called, as you may remember. And so we were thrilled to see SIPA in such good hands now. And I have to say, in all honesty, it's worked out even better than I had hoped, and it's hard to imagine a better time to be starting a world-class energy policy research institute focused on the geopolitics of energy, energy economics, to a better institution to do it as part of, and a better city to do it in than New York. So it really has come together in a fantastic way. I thought what I would do right now for a few minutes is sort of talk a little bit about energy issues as I see them relating to Europe, particularly the UK, and to the US, and really just to kind of tell you about my week. So I've been here all week since Monday morning, speaking to think tanks and academics and reporters and people in industry and people in financial markets and people in the UK government. And here are, and a couple of issues keep coming up again and again. So I would just sort of talk for a minute about those. Like most things in the energy space, they fall into three categories: security, economics, and the environment. That's what makes energy such an interesting area to study. It forces you to bring all those three things together on a constant basis. When it comes to security, the overwhelming obsession certainly now is what's happening in Russia and the situation with the Ukraine, and Europe's very heavy dependence on Russia as the primary supplier of natural gas imports into Europe. And so we've had a lot of conversations this week about how Europe should think about its dependence on Russia, whether the objective should be to reduce dependence on Russia or whether the objective should be to reduce the vulnerability that Europe has to a disruption in Russian supplies. And so those are two different things, because there's a huge price to be paid for reducing dependence on Russian gas, right? It turns out Russian gas is cheap, and Russian gas, to the UK at least, maybe not if you're in the Ukraine, has been pretty dependable. So we had the UK energy minister at Columbia a few weeks ago, and I interviewed him on stage and asked, how do you see Russia as a supplier? It actually has, from the UK perspective, well, you don't get a lot of gas directly here, but into Europe, been a somewhat pretty dependable supplier. And you hear, Russia is as dependent on Europe as a market for its gas in many ways as Europe is on Russia. Russia needs that revenue. So the goal, I think, is to think about how there would be a large premium, 20, 30, 40% to be paid if you were to actually find alternative supplies to Russian gas. And then the question is, if you want to continue to get that gas, how do you reduce the leverage that Russia has to cut off supplies? And I think there are a host of policy reforms that have started to be implemented since the 2009 gas crisis, when supplies were last cut to the Ukraine, to build out increased pipeline infrastructure, increased gas storage, to move the third energy package forward, to promote a more integrated gas market, potentially to increase natural gas production in Europe, although shale is quite a controversial subject, and also to reduce demand and increase energy efficiency. And I think all of those things have a ways to go. We just released a study at the center about the impact of the North American energy boom on European energy security. And I think the US energy boom, a lot of things get exaggerated. It's sort of, you hear the word game changer get tossed around a lot, but it's not an exaggeration to talk about what's happened in the US energy space as a remarkable game changer, where the US, now the largest natural gas producer in the world, will soon be a net exporter of natural gas, and dramatic increase, 3 million barrels a day over the last 3 years of oil production in the US too, which has helped stabilize prices, as we were just talking about, and reduced our import dependence from 60% down to about 25% today, and that will keep declining. So that's a really stunning turnaround. You often hear people in Europe say, just send us your gas and save us from Russia, and the purpose of our study was to talk about why that doesn't actually make a lot of sense. There are really important benefits to US natural gas exports. We've already seen a lot of downward pressure on natural gas prices in Europe that has saved consumers money. If the US exports gas, you'll continue. We estimate about a $20 billion a year saving on Europe's gas bill if the US exports large amounts of natural gas, and Gazprom loses a roughly equivalent amount of revenue, so that's not insignificant. But you don't fundamentally change the share of Europe's natural gas that comes from Russia, and we sort of explain why in the study that is on the center's website now. So that's sort of been one big area of focus, is how to think about European energy security, and in fact, the U.S. is not coming to the rescue anytime soon, although, again, there are significant benefits from gas exports, but a bunch of things that European policymakers need to do. With regard to the economy, the overwhelming, from an energy standpoint, the number one concern has been concern about industrial competitiveness and manufacturing competitiveness in Europe. The perception being that the U.S. natural gas boom has meant very low prices for natural gas in the U.S., high prices for natural gas here, and that's leading manufacturing to flee Europe and relocate to the United States. Historically, natural gas prices around the world had been pretty much close to one another. And with the U.S. shale boom, that relationship has totally broken apart over the last 3 to 4 years. Prices in the U.S. now range from 4 to 5, in Europe 9 to 10, and in Asia 15, 16, 17. So dramatic difference. You don't actually, and that has huge economic benefits for the U.S. It's probably added 0.4, 0.5 percentage points to the growth rate of GDP, maybe even more. Economists sort of differ on that depending on how you count spillover effects and indirect and induced impacts. So it's been one of the brightest spots in a sluggish U.S. Economic recovery. You don't actually see in the manufacturing data a huge manufacturing renaissance happening in the U.S. because of cheap gas. Part of the reason is because the share of the manufacturing sector that is very energy intensive, like fertilizer and petrochemical, is just really small, right? So cheap gas matters a lot for a small fraction of the manufacturing sector, but not for most of it. If you're Boeing and you're competing with Airbus, a small change in the value of the dollar versus the euro swamps whatever impact a decline in natural gas prices would have. So it is an important impact, but I think there are a host of domestic factors related to local regulations and a whole host of other things, labor laws and other things and currency that are involved in thinking about what's happening in the EU manufacturing sector. Also a concern over high energy prices and high electricity prices in the EU, which in some ways is a result of policy, and that connects to the environment question. So a lot of concern over whether we actually can start to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And despite the massive amounts of money being spent on subsidies for renewables, greenhouse gas emissions in the US went up last year. In the EU, they were flat in some places, slightly declined in some places, went up in some places. And you have very heavy subsidies for renewables. You have a very low price on carbon. You have opposition in many places to shale gas and to nuclear, and surprise, when you put all those things together, you get a lot more coal as well. And that's what we've seen, particularly in countries like Germany. And in the UK, coal consumption is up 22% over the last 4 years. And then so consumers see their electricity prices and their energy prices going up. They feel like they're paying a premium. They're paying for something but not seeing benefits in terms of actual environmental returns. And I think that worries me because I worry about a public backlash against being willing to pay what may be necessary to find lower carbon forms of energy moving forward. With regard to oil prices, that's headed in the other direction. So we've seen oil prices slide quite a bit over the last several weeks, about $20 or so, $15 or so. And a lot of question about why that is and whether Saudi Arabia is going to cut production to stabilize oil prices. But it doesn't seem likely that that's probably the case for a bunch of different reasons, which we can get into, but kind of instilling a little bit of discipline in some other OPEC members to remind people that the burden of supporting prices doesn't necessarily have to fall all on them. And I think also maybe an interest in sort of testing the economics of U.S. Shale oil production, which will be interesting to see if prices start to slide, how that responds. And then on the environment, just a lot of discussion this week about the Paris climate negotiations that are coming up at the end of December 2015, and whether it'll be possible for the US and the Europeans to really come forward with aggressive targets for greenhouse gas emission reduction in 2025 and beyond. And I think that's still an open question, but is incredibly important if we want to continue to see progress, as I said, given what's happened recently, which is we haven't made as much progress as we need to. And despite all the attention for climate policy and renewables, if you look not just at what's happening here, but especially what's happening in emerging markets and in Asia, coal is the dominant growing fuel right now around the world. And for those of us who care about doing something about the climate, that's a concern. So that's a little overview of sort of what's happening with Europe and the US on the energy space.
Well, thank you very much. Let me just add one footnote on trade, which is, of course, my field, and one that we continue to engage at Columbia, at SIPA. Just last week, we had a conference that SIPA co-hosted with SAIS around the challenges facing the global trading system. And, after a very long period of stasis in trade policy, the last year and this term of the Obama administration has seen a tremendous amount of activity around trade policy. The president announced in the State of the Union his desire to initiate a transatlantic trade agreement, and there have been now 7 rounds of bilateral talks. I think you might say under the current conditions that Europe is facing, and as Jason called sluggish, but I would say nevertheless a period where the U.S. economy has shown itself to have remarkable resilience and is steadily improving, that the conditions might be ripe for this finally getting off the ground, transatlantic. But of course, the heart of a transatlantic agreement is not going to be in tariffs, because average tariffs are low. They're going to be in regulatory areas and rules. And those have always been, the area that are the most difficult to address. So I think here we are 7 rounds later, and every indication is that they're having real difficulties finding ways to move regulatory coherence and regulatory integration further. I think it's enormously important, and the opportunities are really great, but all early signs are that it's proving extremely difficult, and including with respect to, I think, what the EU is pushing very hard for, which is a chapter on energy. And with aspects that perhaps Jason would comment on later that are requiring liberalization measures in the U.S. the U.S. is unwilling to take. Interestingly, the U.S. is also pushing a trans-Pacific agreement. Here again, it's all about rules. And when Japan raised its hand and said they wanted to be part of it, the whole dynamic changed. And it seemed very exciting because it fit in well with Prime Minister Abe's third arrow. And I think the capital markets in Japan responded very favorably initially. And the Prime Minister was saying Japan is back. That too is running into some obstacles, but I say, keep watching. I think those can be overcome. And as we move into the APEC ministerial in November, I think you're going to see a lot more activity around it. It's a very complex agreement to negotiate, and it's one that I would just observe that is having a very interesting regional consequences, particularly vis-a-vis China. And I think China is undergoing the most significant reforms and consideration of reforms that it has since the late 1990s. Of course, it made many commitments to join the WTO, but this is a moment when the reform movement in China has come to argue that they're necessary for China's own future. So it's really an interesting moment, I would say, in China. Multilaterally, very little is happening. And in fact, there's been some backsliding since June when Prime Minister Modi came in and said that the one agreement that was reached at the Bali Ministerial around trade facilitation had, in his view, some defects. I think that can get back on track, but clearly the world is more interested in regional arrangements than it is in multilateral. So we can talk about these subjects if they are of interest to you. I welcome that. And I think we have an extraordinary array. But I'd like to ask the first question while you are thinking about your own questions. And I suppose I'd like to ask it to all of the panel, but I'll start with Tina. And that is, you have sort of emphasized, and I happen to agree with you, that the liquidity effects of QE have masked geopolitical risk. And I guess my question is, when do these problems around the world, whether it's the Ukraine or ISIS or other things, what is the transmission mechanism in your mind that turns these isolated incidents into more of a global problem?
Well, I mean, this is the million-dollar question. I mean, I think the first thing to mention is that equity markets do not tend to be much affected by geopolitical risks to start with. There have been exercises that have looked at, for example, the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you were an equity investor at that time, a year later, the S&P was up 35% on the back of it. So it's important I could get an op-ed published in the FT every week saying investors are stupid for not thinking about geopolitical risks, except they're not really paid to do that. It's a curious time because, as we know, the investment environment is very globalized, and yet we're not seeing these regional risks become systemic. And that's what needs to happen. Markets are localizing geopolitical risks. Can they keep doing that when the Fed turns the tap off? This is a huge debate, and I can't tell you that we have a clear answer on this even amongst our own internal research team, right? There's a big debate about it. Of course, Janet Yellen, this is what is concerning her, timing and sequencing and everything else. But we know that the Fed is going to taper. The ECB, however, and the BOJ are likely to keep providing liquidity. And I think we've seen, the advent of an era where central banks will continue to be willing to, to behave, to use extraordinary measures to prevent growth from coming off. And that's sort of what's behind my hypothesis. Does that mean that we could have a continuation or a fairly high level of geopolitical risk or country level risks carrying on kind of within some bandwidth of volatility without becoming systemic? I think that that might be the world that we're living in, where you could have the Middle East continue to rumble along, perhaps for many years with sort of episodic spikes in geopolitical risk. But as long as supply dynamics have changed, perhaps we're not in an era where Middle Eastern local crises become systemic. I think the Eurozone might be different, and there would be real concerns if one of the Eurozone countries ended up needing a lot of assistance from the ECB and really tested Mario Draghi, but we're not there yet. I guess I think about this structural trend that I talked about, and that's really how I see it, whereby growth has become disconnected from political sentiment, right? And this idea of whether you say it's because of income inequality or something else, that people no longer believe that elites and the political process is serving them. I think that's a huge problem. In the past, that would have been associated with revolution. We didn't see revolutions in Europe, despite GDP going into reverse, 10 years worth in Greece and some other countries. And we didn't even see massive social unrest. I think what we're seeing is this kind of cracking of the political order, fragmentation risk, and how markets deal with that is far from clear. For now, many investors tell me, that's very interesting, Tina, come back to me when you think it's going to make a difference.
Thank you very much. Well, I can't open this up before asking Jan one question, because he spoke about Europe, but he also is deeply knowledgeable about the Ukraine. And I wonder if you might offer us a comment, because I think you have both a current and a historical perspective.
I think Ukraine really has, speaking of game changers, a game changer in the sense that it really changed the perception of Russia and moved Putin from being a reliable partner within the G7, G8 sort of group, and being an adversary and one who is willing to disregard even written agreements. Ukraine's borders were, in the Budapest Memorandum signed in the mid-1990s, declared inviolable. They received assurances from Russia, UK, and the US, and that's why they gave up their nuclear weapons. Now, what we've seen in this last spring and summer basically is that agreements don't mean anything, and the lesson for any kind of nuclear power or budding nuclear power is under no circumstances should you give up nuclear weapons, which is really, really dramatic. Now, back to Europe, obviously, the Germans are already feeling the results of sanctions. I was at a meeting of governors of central banks a few weeks ago, European and plus Turkey, and they were very worried, in fact, of what the situation would be. Some in particular, Austrian governor of central bank was very worried about the effect on Austria and others. So I think there is a repercussion that right now is limited, but can have building expectations, can have significant effects in pushing Europe from mild growth, stagnation, mild growth into a recession. And if that happens, I think it's going to be really serious. What the bankers were really worried about, central bankers, was the risk that Tina mentioned. They said, look, we can continue and will continue if need be in easing, but we're building risk as we do it, and most people don't realize it, okay? And that, I think, is something that has not really come back home yet in the perception of everybody, is what would happen if it continues. And again, to add to what Tina said, Draghi stopped the violence or convulsions of markets by his statement, but he has not been tested. Right? The question would be, what would happen if there would be another onslaught, the type that we saw before? You clearly don't have time to go to the German court and find out whether you can do something or cannot. You either do it and then try to solve things later politically, or you're told not to do anything, forewarned, and you don't do it, and then I think the situation would be really, really bad. So I think Europe is much more vulnerable than the United States as well. And the Ukraine crisis and the geopolitical repercussions that are there, I think are very serious, especially, Crimea was one thing, very significant, very serious. But I think the events in southeastern Ukraine were particularly worrisome because that's where Russia did not have an immediate need as the Sevastopol base for its navy and so on and so forth, which Crimea, had a significant part. So I think that the instability that's there is quite significant.
Thank you very much. Well, I think I would like to please invite you to ask a question or two, and let us, please, yes.
I have a question on energy. Thanks very much for your excellent diagnosis on EU energy security. I wonder if you could share with us your prognosis. More importantly, what do you think the EU should do to enhance its energy security?
Well, I appreciate that question. I laid out some of the factors that I think are important. I think the focus probably, it's neither realistic nor feasible nor affordable to really think about getting off Russian gas. And so I think what needs to be done is to think about how to reduce the leverage that a threat of cutting off supplies has within the continent. And that means, can you weather reasonably well 6 months or 9 months of disruption, because then it's just not a tool, a weapon that Putin or whoever's there can use. I think the way to do that is, Europe has 75% of its natural gas import capacity, its liquefied natural gas import capacity is sitting idle right now, unused. The problem is you can't get the gas from those import facilities to the places where you need it. You can't get it from Western and Southern Europe to Central and Eastern Europe. So building out increased pipeline capacity within the continent, building out pipeline reversals, building interconnectors, and building more gas storage, right? After the Arab oil crisis, we built through the OECD, through the International Energy Agency, Europe and the US built large stocks of oil in case we needed them to weather a disruption. That doesn't really exist for gas. So gas is different in a lot of ways, but some form of storage and the ability to move gas from where it needs to go, because then you're able to say in the event of real supply shortages, you can bring gas in. You're going to pay more for it, but that's fine. 6 months time, as you still kind of you still can weather that. So I think that's really important. I also think it's important to get policy right in a way that starts to close a little bit of the gap we've seen between wholesale electricity prices and retail electricity prices, because, as I said, I worry that at some point Europeans are reluctant to pay very high energy and electricity prices if they don't sort of see that that is being done for some tangible climate benefit. And so there's a bunch of things that need to be done there in terms of a higher carbon price, and probably thinking about additional forms of energy, low carbon energy, in addition to renewables. Gas is going to play a role, nuclear is going to play a role, and you're going to need all of those things. And then Jan mentioned the sanctions, and that's going to be really important too, about who blinks first, right? Is Europe going to be willing to eat some of the economic pain that you've talked about or not? And I think Putin has a lot of fortitude in terms of how long it'll be before he blinks. And then if Europe starts to feel like they're feeling economic pain as a result of that, and they back down a little bit, I think you could quickly see the sanctions come off, because I don't think the U.S. will want to, impose the economic pain on itself if it sees Western, like Total and others, going in and developing energy in Russia. So it's going to be a big open question about how long the sanctions can stay in place and what the new normal looks like in terms of the economic relationship with Moscow. I think we may be in the beginning of a real fundamental strategic realignment in terms of whatever hope there was for an open market-based economy and an integration of Russia into the global economy, that idea may be dead for a long time. I mean, Russia is learning a lesson from this, right? It was you open your markets, integrate into the global economy, and it turns out when they do that, they're a lot more vulnerable to sanctions because now not just the energy sanctions, which say Exxon and others can't go drill in the Arctic, but really the biggest challenge they're facing is Rosneft's ability to raise capital and to finance deals because they're integrated into the global energy market. So we'll see what lesson they learn from that, but it might be disconnect, go look to China, look east, and we really have sort of a little bit of an economic holding pattern for a while.
Thank you.
Hi. First of all, it's great to see how well Tina is doing. I've had quite a lot to do with referendums in my life. I spent 3 years in Sudan and then came back to the UK, and I'm now living between Scotland and London and working on EU affairs. And I think Tina's really right that there are lots of lessons from the Scottish referendum which I don't think people cottoned onto until very, very late in the day. And in the UK, obviously, it depends what happens in the May 2015 general election, whether or not there is a referendum in or out on the EU. I think it's very clear where American interests, all kinds, security, governmental, economic lie, which is to have the UK in the EU. But I'm also be really interested in the panel's take on what lessons can be learned from the Scottish referendum and particularly on this sort of anti-elite, anti-establishment, that this current feeling of dissatisfaction from the middle classes as well as the disempowered perhaps, and how you can win a referendum in this context.
I think you can win referendum. I mean, I think that's the point. If you ask people what they think, as in Ireland, where they have a constitutional requirement to put EU treaty changes to referendum, people voted against. They vote against. And it tends to be any referenda tends to be an opportunity to register your discontent with the political status quo, whatever it may be at the time. So it's quite risky to offer to hold them. I mean, it has been said that the referendum is the last refuge of the demagogue, on one hand. I think that this has not been digested very well at all. There was a sigh of relief, amongst companies and financial markets that Scottish independence didn't happen. I think that the letdown in Scotland and the fact that the overwhelming majority of Scottish youth were pro-independence tells us that this issue is not going to go away. It could also be channeled in different directions, though. And looking at the Quebec case, which is the most useful comparison, in Quebec they had 2 referenda, and they came to call it the never-endum, right? It just ended up weighing on the whole political process in Quebec for a very long time. Now they probably won't do that again. But what's the effect? I think that it adds to this sense of fragmentation and disconnect, which is and a sense of dissatisfaction. We don't have very good answers because we haven't really been here before in history. We have had, in the developed world, continuously improving living standards since World War II. Now, if you want to take a 200-year trend, could it be that the last 50 years have been this blip and we're returning to a more of a sort of a historical mean where you have high levels of income inequality, because that's the way it used to be? I don't have the answers, but I think that these are the questions we have to ask. On the in-out referendum for the UK, there is very little research which is not politicized. And that is a big problem. You've got the pro and anti campaigns basically cherry picking the data to say that the UK can be like Singapore or that it'll be this huge catastrophe. And it'll be the end of the UK economy. I think, and we're looking at a lot of different phenomena that point toward deglobalization. And I that's how I think we ought to think about it. I mean, I had a debate at lunch today with my friend who had the Queen's Honour, who is a very prominent Scot, and her view was Scotland could go it alone and the UK could go it alone. And she, this is a thoughtful, senior person. That may be, but I think for the wider point is the demonstration effect of independence in any, whether it's Catalan or Scotland or Padania in northern Italy or whatever it might be, and the micro states that could emerge and what that means for the globalization process that you talked about. Can we still have globalization happening at the macro level through trade and capital flows, and at the grassroots level, this cracking effect that I talked about? I'd love to hear what other people think.
Well, we have other questions, so why don't we invite? But I must say this is.
When do I get my wine? That's
this
what
is
I
a
want.
gripping. This is a gripping question. Please.
Just building on the point you've made, the perception among average income people of immigration and globalization is partly a driver of stagnant living standards and the inability to buy a house. How unfair life is. Is there any, if you analyse that, is there any basis to that instinct that people have? Is it
Absolutely, they're right. Real wages have stagnated for the last 25 years.
But is that partly caused by immigration and globalization?
No, it's not, I wouldn't. Well, I would say it's not caused by, but the perception that all these factors driven by elites, like European Union, like enlargement, Big Bang enlargement, which led to more immigration, things happening that people didn't want to happen. I think it's that disenfranchisement sense more than some sort of causal correlation. Did it bring down wages to have lower cost labor coming in? I mean, again, I said I'm not an economist. It might have, but the net effect on the British economy has been a positive one. I mean, I testified in the House of Lords about this. The net effect, what economists talk about, has been a boost for the UK, but I think it's very important to understand that for a lot of people, their living standards have declined. Their expectations for their children are not optimistic, and I think that they are very entitled to be concerned about that, because the logical extension of globalization is that Chinese wages go up and developed market wages come down, right? It's a very simplistic characterization, but there are winners and losers, and economists tend to focus on the macro effect rather than, as talked about, we have a recovery in the UK, but it's not felt by a lot of people. It's certainly not very much felt if you leave the southeast.
But this is one of these issues, as someone who's worked in the trade field, where so many problems get put on the back of trade, when in fact, technological change has been established, I think, by economists to be as much a driver, more of a driver than international trade. And of course, it's compounded by globalization and trade. But I don't know how that debate is unfolding in the UK, but in the US, I think the combination is usually pointed to, but I suspect Jan has...
I would just add, I agree, I would just add 2 points. One is that, when you go back to the 1950s, when you didn't have such a huge dispersion in incomes, the marginal taxes were very high. They were practically almost confiscatory. It was amazing. Until Kennedy, the high marginal tax rate was 80, 90%. It was, basically you gave away whatever you earned. So yes, I mean, that's changed dramatically nowadays. The other thing that's, and it could be reversed, of course, then, therefore. The other thing is, speaking about a feeling among people, expectations, I think that the elites, the politicians, have not been selling the benefits of the European Union enough. Especially the young people whom we heard about how they vote and so on, they take it for granted, all the benefits. They can't imagine that they couldn't travel across borders or convert money, that you have to have permission to take more than certain pocket change, which used to be the case, right, in the 50s, 60s. So they take everything for granted, and of course are critical of things that are in shortfall, that are not there. And I think that's a question of just not presenting the picture properly and not realizing what would be in the absence of. I think that Europe and UK would be much, the UK would be much better if they managed to stay together, coordinate, and get the benefit of the large market, keep the benefit of the large market and enhance it. Part of it is, unfortunately, the recession has been just lasting for so long. You look actually back at the data in the advanced economies on employment and unemployment. If you go back to the 1980s, before the current technological change, internet and all that, when there was a big recession, the unemployment rates were similar, not dissimilar to what we have them now, including the youth unemployment. So it actually, is a question of economic growth. If you get growth going, you can actually eliminate a lot of the problems, and with that, the expectations and negative feelings.
Can I say one more thing? There's a short answer to your point, Alison, too, which is more federalization. One of the trades that I think that leaders may be very tempted to offer in these times where they can't deliver growth, they can't deliver the goodies that they used to through the spoils of winning an election, offer more local rights, because it's the localization, globalization disconnect. I think the temptation might very well be more regional autonomy, regional assemblies, and regional powers over taxation and other things. The English votes for English issues, trope that came out of the Scottish referendum appeals to UKIP voters, by the way, and might be a way to keep, people who are voting Conservative. I mean, there's a lot of room to run before the elections here, but I think federalization could end up being this sort of interim, bargain that might be very tempting for politicians. Again, in an economic and market sense, though, we don't really know what that means. Looser fiscal policy, monetary policy arrangements.
I think one last question, please.
In that context, I would be curious about your views on European competitiveness. I mean, we talk so much about the low growth here. I mean, it's not just really bad at the moment, but I mean, if we look forward, I mean, Asia, carried by China, is steaming ahead. We just heard about US energy independence. I mean, I just think that it's like, if we look at it, I mean, we can't solve our problems, like you said, without growth. We don't see it really happening. And I mean, it doesn't seem like Europe is gaining a lot of influence, quite the contrary. It feels like we're actually losing our influence. We don't have a common foreign and security policy. I mean, we have so many problems. At the same time, other countries are making a lot more money. I mean, we have sovereign wealth funds who are starting to buy a lot more European companies, who are also importing their values for that. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I'm just feeling that Europe is losing influence a lot, and it doesn't get better if we don't get, for example, growth coming up. So I wonder what your perspective is, and do you think that Europe is just going to be a spent force in 10 years, a museum for people from other parts?
That's what Bob Rubin used to say. He used to call me and say, "Tina, tell me about the museum economies in Europe." Well, I'm sure everybody has something to say on that. No, first of all, decline takes a long time. That these are not overnight events, so I wouldn't write off Europe. Just like it was very popular, of course, in the UK to talk about the decline of the United States, and that hasn't happened. So I'm not really a buyer of the declinist theory, because history tells us that things change and there are new sources of growth and innovation. What worries me about Europe as a Californian from the Silicon Valley is this sort of fortress mentality and the demographics. One big difference between the US and Europe, and developed markets politics are all about the maths, is that you have a younger and immigrant-led higher birth rate in the US. In Europe, I think the demographics suggest, and I throw this statistic out all the time, I hope I'm right, that old people can outvote young people for 20 more years. They don't tend to vote for pro-competitiveness policies or infrastructure or R&D or investment in education, right? They vote for healthcare and police. So that might have to change too.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think, there's no immutability to the decline of Europe. Europe can address its ills, and I think Jan is often encouraging that mentality. So I'd like to give Jan and Jason to each 1 minute or 30 seconds before we go and have drinks and celebrate being together, but what is your perspective?
All right. So no, I think Europe really has an incredible potential. So I'd like to be upbeat. I agree with you. Actually, a lot of the recent phenomena that we observe are not so much improvement in productivity, but containment in cost, even in Germany. It's not really the unit labor cost has gone down because of costs going down rather than productivity boosting. So I think Europe really needs to have a strategy, and again, with a large market and strategy, it could do very well. I should part by saying what a friend of mine told me recently. He says, well, you know, this is now taking the opposite view of Europe declining, etc., saying, well, you know, the last 100 years of the Roman Empire, I would have rather been there than on the other side with the barbarians.
Jason?
I would just, I think it's important in all policy issues, this one included, to make sure we focus on the right problem. And so I hear a lot of rhetoric about the role energy is playing in that industrial competitiveness issue, and I think it is a little bit exaggerated. So I think the benefits of a shale boom in the US have been enormous, economically, geopolitically. There are environmental issues, they need to be managed, they're real. But the idea that there's a fracking debate in the UK, and the idea that if we just allow fracking, we're going to have $4 natural gas and our industrial sector is going to double in size overnight, I think is probably too hopeful. And so we need to figure out how to increase domestic energy production here. That's a good thing. We just need to make sure we're kind of focusing on the right issue. And it's a host of the things you just heard about. It's probably not relative energy prices.
Well, I thank you. It's been great to be with you. I'd like to invite you to the Marble Room where we'll have cocktails and we'll just have a chance to continue talking amongst ourselves. And thank you very much for coming. And it's great to see so many Colombians in London. So thank you very much.